Well, hello there. We're back.
Charlie and Linda are here with you.
I'm Charlie.
Happy New Year. I hope you had a wonderful holiday season, and I'm wishing you all good things in the new year.
And today we're going to talk about fear and fearlessness, and how to go from one to the other, preferably from fear to fearlessness rather than from fearlessness to fear. So we're going to talk about what we're really talking about when we talk about fear and fearlessness. And you may have noticed that sometimes if you are in or have ever been in a relationship, that fear can come up. And with some of us, it comes up, but it's very quickly covered with an overlay of another feeling, which could be anger. It could be the impulse to control. It could be desire for something. But very often when there are breakdowns in communication or in relationships, fear is really what's going on underneath the issues that are presenting themselves. And until we really can get a grip on fear, which doesn't mean that we control it or we get rid of it, but come to terms with it in a way that we can actually deal with it and transform it into courage or commitment or intention or fearlessness. Until we can do that, we're not really going to be making much headway in terms of resolving what might have been precipitated by it. So that's why it's really, really important to be able to recognize fear in the different forms that it comes in and have some understanding of how we can respond to this universal emotion that really occurs everywhere with everyone at times. And one of the points that we want to make here today is that fear is not the enemy. Mm-hmm. You want to say something about that?
But how fear may manifest itself can cause a lot of trouble. And so learning how to manage our fear is part of maturing into a responsible adult. And clearly, if we want to have a loving partnership, it is a requirement that we know how to work with our fear, how to manage our fear, how to honor our fear. When I first got into this relationship with Charlie, I had some confusion and some misguided notions about what being loving was. It was a little bit too much on the side of the spectrum of the sticky, sweet, strawberry slush kind of love. And I learned early in my relationship, and I'm grateful to Charlie for teaching me more about bravery and courage and fearlessness, that there is a requirement that we grow the big heart. Cœur is, the French word for heart, and that's the root of courage. So I didn't know about being fierce, about being assertive, about drawing boundaries. And I was really kind of wimpy and weak back then. Fortunately, it was a long time ago. I've learned a lot since then. And some of the confusion that I have about fear being bad, fear being the enemy, or somehow I could conquer it and it would go away. You don't really get rid of fear. You find out what's so important to you, what has heart and meaning, that the commitment to those things are so much bigger than the fear that it recedes into the background. And then it doesn't manifest itself in acting out with denial and avoidance and angry, terrible fights, that you really can have more love in your partnership as the fear recedes into the background. And it's a piece of work, but it's doable.
So there are basically three different types of responses to fear when it gets activated in us. Actually, they're the same responses that animals experience when they experience fear too. And it's the 3 F's: fight, flight, and freeze.
Mm-hmm.
And you may have noticed that you have a particular preference for one of those 3. That, you know, we all have kind of defaults that we're predisposed to go to when we feel threatened. The fear is actually information that our brain is picking up and assessing, that there is a danger or a threat to our physical or emotional well-being that's imminent. It could be immediately imminent, or it could be in a longer term, but we feel some kind of a threat. And so that's important information for us to know so that we can respond to what we perceive as a threat. And of course, the key word there is perceive, because sometimes our perception can tell us that there's an immediate danger here because it's associated, what we're experiencing is associated with something that we may have also experienced in the past that led to some painful consequence. And so we have that perception. And one of the things that fear can help us to do is to assess the reality of the presence of what seems like a threat, a danger. So for example, we have, as humans, we have this thing called the brain that enables us to discern what an appropriate response might be, whether it's to freeze, to fight, or, you know, to flee. And animals don't have that. Other animals, because we're animals too, but other animals generally have only one primary way of dealing with things. I mean, that's their default. It doesn't mean that they can't fight when they need to, but they're kind of predisposed, you know, as we are, to one primary tendency. So in some situations for us, it may be very appropriate to freeze. You know, that saying that like a deer in the headlights. Well, it's very appropriate for a deer to freeze when they're in the woods and there's a predator around that has a keen sense of hearing. Because if that deer freezes, then that predator is not going to be able to hear it move. However, that predisposition to freezing isn't going to really serve it if it's in the middle of the road and there's a headlight from a car coming at it. You know, so that's a good time for flight. You want to move. Mm-hmm. And we can do that. You know, we have, as humans, we have the capacity to be able to discern appropriate responses. Sometimes we need to take a stand. You know, we need to hold our ground and to be firm and strong and clear. And sometimes, you know, we need to remove ourselves from a situation. We need to leave it.
So fight, flight, and freeze are good options to have, because there'll be circumstances where they'll be useful, will be skillful. If you're only limited to those and you don't have a wider repertoire that includes risk, that's when it can be too much of a good thing and it can get you into trouble. So people seem to really appreciate the vignettes from the client stories, people that actual cases that we've worked with that illustrate becoming more adept when their fear has it in their grip about how they get out of that grip. And this particular couple is a couple of lesbian women who were in partnership and had a little girl. And they came from different kind of backgrounds. One of the women came from a really chaotic background where there are explosions of anger, and it was so frightening for her that she came kind of repressed into the relationship with her partner. The other partner told me my house was like the morgue. Do you know, people hardly even spoke. There wasn't any noise, and there was definitely not expression of feeling. They made the morgue look good, how repressed everything was in my family. So she came without experience about expressing what was true for her. Their relationship got into some trouble because there were so many accumulations of things that they hadn't dealt with, years worth. And there were so many incompletions that it finally drove them into therapy. And they were committed to having an intact family and a loving partnership to raise this little girl in that they were both very devoted to. They were crazy about the kid. So they knew that they were going to have to find a wider repertoire. Gradually, they began to take the incomplete issues and their unfinished business off of the pile and find that which they were most committed to was, want to have a good relationship with you. I want to model for our little girl. I want to break the patterns from the family of origin that are not serving us now. And that would be their guiding light in the dark, so they could bring up the tough issues. They could talk about how afraid they were to bring some of these things out of hiding for fear that it was going to be so disruptive, or they wouldn't know how to handle the difference. They were fearful that it could break up the relationship. They had all manner of fears just because they were inexperienced. They were fearful that the other person might break confidentiality and tell somebody something that they were bringing up that was very personal and raw and vulnerable. They were also afraid that it might be used against them, that it might be thrown up to them later. And they were fearful that they would be seen as weak if they spoke openly about their fears and their insecurities. And so this was really risky behavior, but over time with practice, they got good at it, and then they were no longer an avoidant couple that only had the freeze, and the flee. And there was some disruption. They did have some arguments, but they decided that that was a good sign that they were coming out of hiding. And I was really proud of the work that they did.
So it's always really helpful to get a sense or an understanding of, well, what is my default? Where do I tend to go when I feel like I'm under siege, or when I'm being threatened, or when I feel fearful about anticipating something? Like some of us are predisposed to, get aggressive and want to fight or argue or get defensive. And some of us are more predisposed to be accommodating. But, okay, don't get upset, whatever you want, I'll do it, just don't get mad at me. And sometimes accommodation to some degree can be a very effective strategy,
and procrastination is a big one.
Yeah.
I'll bring it up. We'll deal with it when I'm not so afraid.
Yeah.
As if waiting it out's going to work.
Yeah. Yeah. That point of getting to the place where I'm not afraid anymore. Don't hold your breath waiting for that one to happen. Fearlessness really is not about waiting until you no longer have fear, but it's about making something a higher priority, more important than the avoidance of the risk of encountering a situation, of taking a step in the direction that could mean shifting the context of the situation that you're in.
Mm-hmm. And I used to be so afraid of my fear and afraid of mentioning how many different things I was afraid of, that Charlie would think I was just some kind of loser or a wuss. And as I started to practice being more assertive and more honest and more authentic, and I brought my fears to him, it was a peak experience for me. I'll never forget it when he said, "Bring all your fear to me, I'm going to eat it." And it was sort of a way to play with it, that I didn't have to be so petrified and terrified. It's just fear. It's just emotion, and not to make it to be some kind of a monstrous, destructive, or shameful thing.
Yeah, we can literally get afraid of our fear. It's like what Roosevelt said. the beginning of the Second World War. The only thing we have to fear is what? Fear.
Fear itself.
And so that's why it's so important not to designate fear as the enemy, something that has to be eliminated or eradicated or destroyed, or that is going to threaten our well-being. Fear can be, depending upon how we view it and relate to it, our greatest ally, because it's bringing us information about the possibility of our well-being being jeopardized by something.
When we talk with each other about our fears, and there are all kinds, fears of going crazy, and fears of being controlled, and fears of being abandoned. There are so many different types of fears. And when we develop a sense of curiosity and wonder, and we start to exchange with our partner what our fears are, they usually have different fears than we have. They can help normalize them and take some of the claws and the fangs out of them so that they're not quite as fearful as they were. It's like it demystifies them. Do you know, it normalizes them. And we all have fear. Sometimes Charlie says, it's not that we have too much fear. We just don't have enough fear about the right things. Mm-hmm. Do you know? Right. That the things that we ought to be fearful of, we're sometimes not even cognizant of.
Yeah.
Like being afraid of getting to the end of our life and feeling like we've blown it in a lot of ways. Mm. And why didn't I risk more? Why didn't I try some things? Why didn't I have a spirit of adventure? Why didn't I bring up, you know, the subjects that I thought were a little too hot to handle? Why didn't I at least give it my best shot? Because we don't want to get to the end of our life feeling like we have regrets.
There's a great book about that called The 5 Top Regrets of the Dying. And it's written by an Australian woman who was a caregiver to many people in her life. And she was with them at the end stages of their lives, and she spoke with many of them about regrets that they might have had about things that they did. And it was most of the regrets were not about things that they did, it was about things that they didn't do, because they were afraid. And from this perspective of looking back on your life, because there's very little future in front of you, they were able to see the remorse that they had about the risks that they had been afraid to take and wish that they had taken. And so when Linda talks about things that you might want to be afraid of, that you should be afraid of, that's an example of that. Mm-hmm. Be afraid of coming to the end of your life with regrets about things that you wanted to do but were afraid to do. Have those regrets now before it's too late.
Mm-hmm. So there's an author named Jeffers, and she wrote a book called Feel the Fear and Go for It Anyway. And when I heard that phrase, I adopted it for myself. And I used it as an empowerment strategy, like a mantra, that if I noticed that there was something that I was afraid of, to deeply examine it, whether I was making up a bunch of stories about, you know, how terrible the risk was and the awful consequences. I have a catastrophizing mind, so I can be thinking of worst case scenarios, and really take time not to be afraid to face the fear, not to be afraid to investigate the fear. Really look into it and take a look and see, how likely is it that those awful things might happen? And what are the possible benefits if you bring up the tough subjects, if you say no, if you draw boundaries, if you say this doesn't work for me and this hasn't been working for me, and this is my deepest heart's desire, and I'm so disappointed and so fearful that I'm never going to have it. And it's so important to me, and it includes you. It's not something that I can really do completely on my own. And having those crucial conversations, sometimes difficult, kind of scary conversations, this can make all the difference in deepening the relationship. And what we found over the years is the couples who have the good relationships, as compared and contrasted to the people who have the great relationships, It's that depth of intimacy. They don't have no-fly zones. They don't have taboo subjects. They trust themselves, and they've grown the trust with each other that they can bring up anything. And I think that's really hitting the jackpot when you have that much safety, authenticity, honesty, and fearlessness in your partnership.
You know, we've spoken about this phenomenon a number of times in some of these talks about how the couples who are more avoidant, who tend to avoid talking about potentially uncomfortable subjects, are much more likely to lose their relationships or divorce than couples who are volatile and tend to argue a lot. Because the couples who argue, not that, you know, a lot of arguing is a good thing, it's not, but it's actually less damaging to a relationship if there is a willingness to keep engaging, even if there is some arguing, than if you are avoidant. Because if you're avoidant, it's sort of like somebody who's stopped eating. There's no nourishment that's going into the relationship. There's not enough interaction. There's not enough depth. There's not enough connection to keep it healthy. And so what happens is that it atrophies, it withers, because it doesn't, it's getting neglected. And those are the relationships that are much more at risk than the ones, even where there's a lot of arguing. And of course, the best relationships are the ones where there isn't a lot of arguing and there is a lot of engagement. And those relationships, tend to be very fulfilling for both people, and they're not at risk as much because they're getting the attention that they need. And many of the couples that we've spoken with and have worked with have come to be able to create those kinds of we call them validating relationships, where they're continually validating each other because they're no longer afraid of the difficulties and the difficult subjects that they used to avoid or they used to argue about. And the way they got to that point is they were willing, they had a mutual agreement that, we're going to replace avoidance with honesty. We're going to learn how to trust each other. I mean, this was, for many of them, it was a conscious, overt agreement that they made. And for some of them, it was just something that they made to themselves, but they were both willing to honor that. They were willing to risk telling the truth to each other and to speak it in ways that were responsible rather than blaming. So it's not as though once you make that decision, everything is going to be fine and easy and perfect. No, once you make that decision, that's the beginning of what can be a very challenging process. So you've got to be able to be willing to risk that we're going to fall flat on our faces sometimes, that we're going to make mistakes. We're going to say things that are going to trigger each other. But what we have to do is we've got to be able to learn and connect the dots and see what works and what doesn't work, and learn from the things that we see, from the patterns that are going to be coming up here, that these are things that we need to change and that I need to change. And mistakes are really part of the process. And when we talk about trust of ourselves and each other and trust in the process, what we're talking about is having the assurance and the confidence in ourselves and in each other that we're going to survive this, that to know that this is something that everybody who wants to have a good relationship has got to be willing to make mistakes and to go through some difficulties, but to learn from them and to integrate those lessons in the relationship.
So I want to thank you.
You're welcome.
I want to thank
For what?
you
What is it I've been thankful
for teaching me how to be more bold.
Yeah.
Because my ideas about what loving partnership was a little too sweet. And that's an important part too.
Yeah, sweetness is okay.
But finding my commitment to have an honest relationship with you and to have a great relationship with you, I quickly learned, not too far into the relationship with you, that it was going to demand honesty and facing into the challenges. And I had to rely many, 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 many times on that commitment to what was bigger to me than the fear.
Yeah.
That I wanted to be real with you.
Yeah.
And we had a lot of difficulty. It was a rocky road.
Yeah.
And I'm appreciative that you hung in there with me while I grew courage. And I feel like we've become one of those validating couples. I was avoidant. When I came out of hiding and I wasn't avoidant anymore, then I was hell on wheels and I was, screaming banshee. But you hung in there with me when I was so volatile, till I could calm down, till I had the kind of self-discipline to form what I needed and what I wanted to say and what I wanted to be heard about in a way that you could hear me. But you've taught me a lot about risk, and you've taught me a lot about honesty, and you've taught me a lot about speaking up, and I will always be grateful because I feel like it's spilled over into every little nook and cranny in my life to be more courageous. So I have more love with the kids and the grandkids and my friends and my work and my clients and my students and everywhere. It's so essential. It's just core. And I never understood it when I was young, how essential courage is and fearlessness is. And I don't wait for the fear to go away anymore.
Yeah. Wow. Well, that feels really good to hear that. It feels really validating to me. And what it reminds me of is how grateful I am to you for what you've taught me about vulnerability. Because the fear that I had was covered up with anger and intimidation.
Yeah.
And I was pretty good at that, but I had no idea.
You were the manipulation champ back in the day.
Yeah, it's absolutely. I had no idea what it was costing me and how that was a huge factor in our relationship, because I kept noticing, what you needed to do and what your problem was. And as you became more forthright and more willing to take a stand and to speak your truth and to be able to tolerate me without wimping out, that forced me to go inside and start looking at myself.
You're welcome.
So
and thank you for taking influence from me.
It was very mutual in terms of how we learned from each other. And that's kind of the challenge, I think, for all couples, is because everybody has some version of that issue.
Yeah. And Ken Kai says, the secret of life is sticking with it. Yeah. Just don't quit.
Yeah. Yep.
We worked it. We had a lot to learn, but we learned and we worked it.
Yeah.
And we're enjoying the benefits now and have been for a long time. So I think we have a leg to stand on to offer this to our viewing audience.
So speaking of our viewing audience, how much more time do we have here?
A minute.
Oh, we don't have much time left. Well, thanks for tuning in. And I hope that you can join us next week when we're going to talk about the S word. The 3-letter word that ends with X and starts with S. I'm not going to tell you what the second letter is, but that's what we're going to be talking about. So you don't want to miss that.
So we want to remind you to tell your Facebook friends about the Bloomtalks that are all archived, and we hope that you will also mention to them that if they go to bloomwork.com, that's our website, there are 3 very valuable, chock full of practical wisdom ebooks, one on arguing, one on sex, and one on the 10 things that we most wish that we had known when we got married. So there's valuable information there for free if they sign up to be on our email list, and we send out a booster shot of inspiration once a month.
And speaking of emails, if you enjoyed this talk or got something out of it or any of our talks, feel free to email us.
We love hearing from you.
Let us know. Just go to our website, Bloomwork. It'll tell you how to contact us. In the meantime, enjoy.
Happy New Year!